Over the past 3 decades, there have been literally hundreds of Final Fantasy games released, re-released, remastered, and remade. Some of these are now regarded amongst the best games of all time, while others have been there to keep the fanbase engaged or as a way of building out the ever-expanding universes of subseries such as Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy XV. But even though so many games have been released, there are still countless others that never got the chance. They were either cancelled during early stages of development as the idea was stress tested and found wanting, or much closer to the intended launch as problems were encountered that could never be resolved. Such instances almost always lead to a lot of discussion and speculation amongst members of the community about what unfinished projects may have looked like, and how they may have performed. Because while some of them may well have flopped, what if there was a hidden gem somewhere in there that just needed a bit more care and attention? It can therefore be fun to imagine what it would have been like to play a Final Fantasy game that doesn't exist, but could have. And that is why we wanted to go over every known cancelled Final Fantasy game, because there are plenty out there, and there may even be some that you may not have been aware of. So why not sit back and relax as we kick things off with a rather unorthodox game based around a fan favourite mascot, Chocobo de Battle. Chocobos are perhaps one of the most iconic creatures in the Final Fantasy franchise, appearing in nearly every single title under its umbrella. And as Square looked to explore how they could expand their portfolio of properties associated with Final Fantasy, creating games based around the adorable mascot made a lot of sense. It saw Square explore numerous ideas for games outside of their traditional genres, and one of the most intriguing experiments in this regard was meant to be a fighting game called Chocobo de Battle. The plan was for the game to be Square's first foray into the arcade gaming scene, with a PlayStation release also considered. And to go alongside with the notion of pushing into genres outside of the traditional, instead of it being a 2D or 3D fighting game like Street Fighter or Tekken, where specific characters square off against each other, the uniqueness of Chocobo de Battle was meant to come via players controlling characters who were riding chocobos. And while few of the intended fighting commands and combos were ever revealed, some footage was shown that depicted a mechanic where chocobos could fire missiles at one another. In terms of visual presentation, Chocobo de Battle employed a behind-the-camera view rather than a profile view seen in many other classic fighting games. But like most of its contemporaries, the roster was planned to contain a mixture of characters and chocobos. But amongst this already unusual concept, perhaps one of the most curious aspects of the game were its intended controls. As if it wasn't already bizarre enough, instead of using a standard stick and buttons, the arcade version of Chocobo de Battle was designed to operate using motion controls. This would have seen players move their hands over a blue motion-sensing board using certain gestures to maneuver their characters and execute specific actions. Perhaps because of how ambitious this project was, Chocobo de Battle ended up being cancelled. When speaking to us, Hironobu Sakaguchi shared that the initial objective was to create a game that celebrated the impact of chocobos, but after reaching a certain point in the game's development, they took stock and realised that the concept of chocobos fighting against each other was perhaps not the best way to do that, especially since they don't even have arms. But even though the game never materialised, the notion of celebrating chocobos did still manifest through games like Chocobo's Dungeon and Chocobo Racing. Now, Chocobo Racing itself turned out to be a very competent kart racing game, and for many years there were calls for it to be franchised itself. Releasing in the late 90s, Chocobo Racing saw Square attempt to capitalise on the kart racing craze that was taking over due to the initial success of Super Mario Kart and subsequent games like Street Racer, Wacky Wheels, and Diddy Kong Racing. The premise was very similar, but instead of Chocobo de Battle, or indeed the Chocobo Racing found in Final Fantasy VII, where players rode chocobos, here, players selected from Final Fantasy mascots, classes and characters and raced in more traditional modes of transport. This meant alongside chocobos, players could also choose from a Moogle, Bahamut and even Squall. The game itself was competent, and the issues people had, such as track design and controls, could have been ironed out with subsequent releases. But the game remained dormant for many years. That was until E3 2010, when Square Enix announced a new Chocobo Racing game called Chocobo Racing 3D that was set to be released for the Nintendo 3DS. There was a degree of excitement about this, but nothing more was ever learnt about the game, and in late 2013, Takashi Tokita, who directed the original Chocobo Racing, shared that the game had been cancelled. He revealed that the reason for the cancellation was that Chocobo Racing 3D was just not of a high enough quality to justify its release, and that it had been developed for the wrong demographic, adults instead of children. Tokita, also quite interestingly, shared that the project was being handled by someone else, but that if he had been put in charge, he would have made sure that it came out. A decade later, Chocobo Racing did then receive its long-awaited successor in the form of Chocobo GP. Tokita was again not involved in a leadership capacity, and the game was panned upon launch for numerous reasons, with one being the overly aggressive monetization strategies Square Enix had chosen to employ. Compared to Final Fantasy I and II, which have been remade and re-released countless times, Final Fantasy III can sometimes feel quite isolated, but that wasn't meant to be the case. Despite releasing numerous high-profile video games throughout the late 90s, Square had been crippled from a financial perspective by the dismal box office performance of The Spirits Within. To try and turn the fortunes of the business around, additional revenue streams were explored, and it was for this reason that Square entered into a dialogue with Bandai about porting older Final Fantasy games to their upcoming handheld console, the WonderSwan Color. After numerous discussions, Square then signed a deal that saw them commit to releasing their 3 8-bit Final Fantasy games on the upcoming system, and they were planned to be remade from the ground up to take advantage of the system's capabilities. The original Final Fantasy subsequently released as a launch title on the 9th of December 2000, with Final Fantasy II then releasing a year after. Due to their success, the deal was then expanded, and Final Fantasy IV was re-released on the WonderSwan Color towards the start of 2002. But the remade version of Final Fantasy III never materialized. According to reports, the game was in a playable state, but Square had delayed publishing the game for undisclosed reasons. Towards the start of 2003, it was then rumoured that Bandai had even purchased the rights to publish the game themselves, but as production of the WonderSwan Color had ceased by this point, with the handheld system having not managed to perform well enough against Nintendo's offerings, Bandai also decided not to push forward. Hiromichi Tanaka later shared that whereas remaking the first 2 Final Fantasy games, and indeed Final Fantasy IV, was quite straightforward, replicating the process for Final Fantasy III was not. The issues came from how much content was crammed into the original game. When Final Fantasy III was produced for the Famicom, the team had stretched the memory allocation to the absolute limit. Every single one of those audio and visual assets was then needed to be recreated for the WonderSwan Color version. If they wanted to keep everything consistent across Final Fantasy I, II, and III, there just wasn't enough storage capacity for them to make that a reality. Even if there was though, the other challenge was around manpower, as they would have had to assign people to recreate those assets, and there just weren't enough people available. Final Fantasy III then suffered a similar fate when it was considered for re-release on the Game Boy Advance. Every single 8-bit and 16-bit Final Fantasy ended up being released on the Game Boy Advance, the only exceptions being Final Fantasy III and Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. But even though work was complete on Final Fantasy III Advance, just like it was complete on the WonderSwan Color version, similar problems were encountered, and the game ended up being cancelled. Final Fantasy III was not the only game to suffer from woes throughout development though, as the same applied to a proposed localized version of Final Fantasy II. With the North American release of the original Final Fantasy selling so well, especially in comparison to both the Japanese version and the localized port of the original Dragon Quest, Square were keen to take advantage of the momentum. Their North American subsidiary had started work on a localized version of Final Fantasy II under the supervision of Kaoru Maruyama. By that time, however, Final Fantasy II had already been available in Japan for over a year, and Final Fantasy III wasn't too far out from release. The plan was therefore to speed up work on the North American releases to capitalise on the hype that was building around the brand. Such was the confidence of Square's North American subsidiary that they even went live with a marketing campaign that said, "We see the future as a never-ending battle." Everything was set up for Final Fantasy to dominate the North American market, but localization times would prove to be a significant stumbling block. Localization itself had never been factored into the initial development roadmap, and as Final Fantasy II placed much more emphasis on narrative, it meant the English release faced an unforeseen barrier in the form of memory capacity. Ahead of an intended launch, further promotional assets were also created, with emphasis on a new subtitle, Final Fantasy II Dark Shadow over Palakia. But due to everything taking so long, and with the Super Nintendo looming on the horizon, Square ended up flat out cancelling the North American release of Final Fantasy II. After suffering from years of development hell, Square Enix decided to just focus on producing a full-on 3D remake of Final Fantasy III that could leverage the technical capabilities of Nintendo's upcoming console, the Nintendo DS. And upon launch, the Final Fantasy III remake proved that a 3D remake of an old Final Fantasy game could not only succeed, but do so in spades. And due to how well it had been done, and the nature of the game that had served as the benchmark, production for a remake of Final Fantasy IV started with immediate haste. After the release of the Final Fantasy IV remake, many fans assumed that Square and Matrix Software would turn their attention towards producing similar remakes for Final Fantasy V and VI. But when everyone reconvened, they had a rather different idea about what their next foray on the Nintendo DS should be. Instead of continuing to dive into the past and attempting to modernize an older game, there was a belief that the knowledge gained from working on the two remakes could be applied to create something original, a first true Final Fantasy spin-off in what had been a considerable period of time. It led to Square Enix facing something of a quandary. On the one hand, they wanted to reward Tomoya Asano and Takashi Tokita for their efforts in producing the Final Fantasy III and IV remakes. But on the other hand, they would be leaving money on the table by not remaking Final Fantasy V and VI. They therefore decided to try and do both. But even though Asano and Tokita were able to fulfill their objective of producing Final Fantasy The Four Heroes of Light, Square Enix were unable to fulfill theirs. Matrix Software was a very handy development partner, and they were the ideal partner to work on the Final Fantasy V and VI remakes. But with them occupied by Asano, Square Enix attempted to recreate the output themselves, and struggled. In 2010, a year after the Four Heroes of Light released, it led to Shinji Hashimoto addressing everything that was happening by saying that even though they had explored remaking 5 and 6, they had encountered technical issues. Hashimoto therefore suggested that fans shouldn't get their hopes up. He then though clarified this statement a few months later, saying that due to how much time had passed, Square Enix were now considering a different approach. He noted that rather than creating a 5 and 6 remake for the current DS, what we want to do is look at how the 3DS evolves, and then make a decision. But after this, the notion of remaking 5 and 6 was completely swept under the carpet. This wasn't the first time Square had attempted to remake Final Fantasy V and VI, however, as many years earlier they had attempted to do a complete recreation of the 16-bit era of Final Fantasy. As we mentioned before when talking about the cancelled version of Final Fantasy III for the WonderSwan Color, Square were in some financial difficulties and were keen to explore all options available to them. With the Game Boy Advance out of the picture, the initial plan was to create 16-bit remakes of Final Fantasy I through III for the WonderSwan Color, but they also had plans to create remakes for their 16-bit Final Fantasy games too. These plans were revealed to investors on the 22nd of January 2001 as reported by Famitsu magazine. They write up notes that alongside plans to release updated versions of Final Fantasy VII through IX for the PlayStation 2, which we'll be talking about in more detail in a bit, Square were also working on remakes of Final Fantasy IV through VI. But the curious detail is that they had not yet decided on specific platforms, and there were no release dates to share. Further down in the article, Famitsu listed Final Fantasy IV, V, and VI within the upcoming mobile games column, but we'll perhaps never know what the intended platforms were. There were a few scenarios that could have happened, however. Final Fantasy IV did end up releasing on the WonderSwan Color the following year, and this was a modified version of the PlayStation port, but there could have also been plans to create WonderSwan colour versions of Final Fantasy V and VI that were then abandoned when the console itself started to flounder. All three games also ended up launching on the Game Boy Advance. The first game did not release until 2005 though, and it's unlikely that Square would have been planning that far out, especially as they had only just entered into a very uneasy agreement with Nintendo about returning to their systems. The other scenario is that they were planning to do a more holistic remake for each of the games, but we'll probably never know. Around the same time that Square were toying with producing remakes of Final Fantasy IV through VI, they were also exploring how they could bring the two latter games to personal computers, as they sought to take advantage of how big that market was in the West. The reality was that role-playing games had enjoyed strong performance in the West, and indeed had done so too in Japan for some time on PCs, but Square had moved away from supporting PCs in Japan and had almost no foothold in the Western market. Square had also struggled with localization, and a localized version of Final Fantasy V had been shelved indefinitely due to a perceived consumer expectation mismatch. They had high hopes for Final Fantasy VII, however, and in the build-up to its launch, they spoke of their desires to launch the game on PC, before using it as a stepping stone to expose PC gamers to some of their back catalogue. This news was delivered via an investor Q&A session. Square were quizzed about their upcoming pipeline and support for platforms outside of the PlayStation. These included the Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64, Windows 95 PCs, and Macintosh. They spoke about there being no desire to further support the Super Nintendo, and were coy about the Nintendo 64, stating that they may open a dialogue with Nintendo if the proposed Nintendo 64 Double D expansion ever materialised. Macintosh support was also debunked, but they were very forthright about their plans to support Windows 95 PCs. Their initial ambition was for a PC version of Final Fantasy VII to launch mere months after the PlayStation version. Final Fantasy V and VI were then to launch at the end of 1997 and the start of 1998 respectively. But this plan ended up being heavily modified. Eidos, who had been commissioned to work on the PC port of Final Fantasy VII, took much longer than expected due to how many issues they encountered. This meant the PC port didn't release a few months after the PlayStation version. Instead, it was released 17 months after. Such a delay massively impacted ports for Final Fantasy V and VI, and Square decided instead to just release ports for the PlayStation, which were based on initial work done on the PC versions. Now, during the earlier years of the franchise, in what we might call the Sakaguchi era, there was a cardinal rule that games had to remain standalone. Sequels and spin-offs were allowed, but they needed to exist within supporting mediums such as novels and OVAs. This rule was pretty firm, but it wasn't necessarily a rule that everyone agreed with, as Yoshinori Kitase was always exploring ways to expand the properties that he was involved with. And in one particular case, this could have seen the development of a Final Fantasy VI spin-off that was focused around city building. This revelation came via a passing comment Kitase made as he was reminiscing about Final Fantasy VI as part of its 25th anniversary. Kitase shared that the concept would have been based around Strago cultivating a village, stating that it would have been similar to SimCity, just on a smaller scale. It sounded rather fascinating as a concept, but even though initial planning was done, development was cancelled due to scheduling issues. The idea of a city-building Final Fantasy title then actually resurfaced much later. In the year 2000, Square released a game called Working Chocobo for the WonderSwan. It was a life simulator where players raised chocobos and worked alongside them to cultivate their land and earn items. Perhaps the Final Fantasy VI city builder would have shared some of the framework of this particular game. However, it's uncertain what the reception would have been like, as Working Chocobo unfortunately only sold around 9,000 copies in its lifetime. Final Fantasy IV has a rather complicated development story, and if you'd like to find out the full, rather detailed version, then please check out the complete history of Final Fantasy IV, which we've linked to in the description below. For now though, here's the abbreviated version. Throughout the development of Final Fantasy III, there was a degree of flux in the market as Nintendo were preparing to launch their next major console. It just kept suffering from significant delays. Towards the end of 1989, when decisions were being made around the next generation of Final Fantasy software, the marketing and sales department therefore pushed for the franchise to appeal to a broader demographic, using their industry research to support their case. They knew that such an objective always had the potential to be challenging, as there was a risk of alienating existing fans in the pursuit of new ones, but for the franchise to continue to grow and thrive, they felt it was a necessary step to take, especially as the Super Famicom itself had the potential to attract a new audience. They therefore used their growing influence to push for a forward-thinking plan that initially enabled them to cater to both old and new audiences at the same time, as this meant they planned to produce Final Fantasy IV for the Famicom and Final Fantasy V for the Super Famicom, with the same development team working on both games simultaneously. In the first few months of this plan, everything seemed to be working. By November 1990, vertical slices for both games had been produced, and between then and the end of the year, they were shown off to the sales and public relations departments, but also the rest of the company. The idea was to gain feedback from a wider audience so that revisions could be made sooner rather than later, or if need be, the projects could be taken back to the drawing board. But feedback on both projects was positive. Both games had strong mechanics and storylines. However, question marks started to be raised around the proposed release schedule, as Final Fantasy V was actually announced before Final Fantasy IV, and they intended to release them out of sequence. In the end, it was decided that such a decision had the potential to negatively impact the brand. The reality was that Final Fantasy V had been developed with a very clear objective of surpassing Final Fantasy IV in every conceivable way. But with it planned to release second, the fear was that when it did eventually go to market, it would look incredibly poor by comparison. This led to Square issuing a statement to the public. They were forced to explain the cancellation of Final Fantasy IV on the Famicom and the subsequent rebranding of Final Fantasy V as Final Fantasy IV. And in interviews that took place in and around the cancellation, Sakaguchi tried to do some damage limitation by stating that not much work was ever done on the Famicom version and that it barely made it out of the concepting phase. But many years later, the subject was revisited, and Sakaguchi shared that he had actually lied in those initial interviews because he was embarrassed and wanted to save face. The game was actually around 80% complete when the decision was taken to cancel it. Now, we've spoken about the cancellation of remakes of Final Fantasy V and VI, but remakes of Final Fantasy VII, VIII, and IX were also announced and then cancelled. Back in 2001, just over 6 months after Final Fantasy IX had been released in Japan, and before the games had even shipped to Europe, Square Enix announced that they were working on a trilogy of remakes. And this announcement was completely out of left field, not least because the games weren't even that old at that point. According to the press release, Final Fantasy VII, VIII, and IX were planned to be remade for the PlayStation 2, with each game taking advantage of the additional space offered by the new DVD format, which in turn was meant to allow for graphical and audio enhancements. This suggested that the remakes would have been more limited in scope than the full ground-up reimagining of Final Fantasy VII that ended up releasing on the PlayStation 4. It was more likely that this trio of remakes would have been more similar to Final Fantasy XII The Zodiac Age, serving as a soft update to the original game, with improved presentation and perhaps some enhanced or adjusted mechanics. What's strange, however, was that after the announcement, nothing was ever heard about the projects again, and they were quietly cancelled. It's never been revealed what happened, but the most logical reason for their cancellation relates to what was happening at the time. Square was, of course, going through a rather tumultuous period, and with Yuichi Wada taking the helm, he must have felt that resources could have been better spent elsewhere to help turn around the fortunes of the ailing company. The notion of Final Fantasy VII even being enhanced for the PlayStation 2 could have been very different, however, had initial plans for the game been carried out as intended. Following the launch of Final Fantasy VI, Square were riding high. The game had generated the equivalent of over $200 million within just 4 weeks of its release, and that figure only continued to rise over time. Now, after the release of every game, Square had always sought to create quick follow-ups, but this time they found themselves in a bit of a quandary. They had seldom had to deal with new console generations, and the previous one had caused numerous issues. They had attempted to have their cake and eat it, but the Famicom version of Final Fantasy IV ended up being cancelled as a result. This time they decided to be a bit less greedy. Instead of working on a game for next generation hardware, they chose to instead create another game for the Super Famicom. But to ensure it had a short development cycle, the decision was taken to simply come up with a new art style and complicated gameplay mechanics while reusing as many assets as possible and iterating. This approach was at odds with how Final Fantasy V and VI had been developed, but it was deemed to be logical due to the requirements of a tight turnaround time. 3 months after Final Fantasy VI shipped, Kitase then pulled together a team of around 20 to 30 people, and they started planning out Final Fantasy VII for the Super Famicom. Their objective was to figure out what boundaries they could push and still innovate, despite having to be as iterative as possible. And the main area they chose to focus on was the story. Sakaguchi provided a loose premise, and Kitase then worked with the team to develop that premise. But before they were able to get very far, disaster struck. At the time, Square were also working on an ambitious project called Chrono Trigger that served as a collaboration between Square, Enix, and an influential artist named Akira Toriyama. Because of who was involved, there were a lot of eyes on the project and a high degree of pressure. It couldn't afford to fail. But that's what loomed on the horizon based on how everything was shaping up. To try and fix the problem, senior figures from across Square were pulled in to help out, and this included Kitase and many other members of the provisional Final Fantasy VII development team. As a result, work on the Super Famicom version of Final Fantasy VII was shelved. Due to how long it then took to fix Chrono Trigger, by the time the team were able to resume work on the game, the industry had moved on. The tight window they had given themselves to release Final Fantasy VII on the Super Famicom was no longer available. This then led to the complete cancellation of that iteration of the game, as the team instead started thinking about how they could release Final Fantasy VII on the next generation of consoles. With the PlayStation Portable on the horizon, and numerous shifts taking place in the Japanese video game industry, Yoshinori Kitase was keen to figure out how more fans could be exposed to the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. Their first step had been producing a mobile game called Before Crisis, and this was followed up by a CG movie called Advent Children. The next step, however, was not so clear. Unlike Final Fantasy X, where they were able to produce Final Fantasy X-2 as a quick follow-up, producing a proper video game sequel to Final Fantasy VII was not so easy. Things had moved on too much, and this meant they couldn't simply reuse assets or use a smaller team of developers. Their core team were also knee-deep working on Final Fantasy XIII, so Kitase decided to get creative when thinking about how they could maximize profitability. The immediate path that stood out was creating a port of Before Crisis for the PlayStation Portable. As much of the game was already complete, they could create a version that packaged everything together and ditched the paid-for episodic release structure. With the plan laid down, Tetsuya Nomura and Hajime Tabata set to work on what was provisionally going to be called Before Crisis Core, with the core there to denote that it was the core version of the game. But the pair felt that simply porting Before Crisis would not do the game justice, and it also wouldn't stack up well against other games being released on the system. The entire concept therefore underwent a complete shift, and they went back to Kitase with a new pitch, creating an entirely new game called Crisis Core that would expand on the narrative arc of Zack Fair. The positive of this approach was that much of Zack's story had already been written, it just wasn't ever put into the game, and as they already knew how Zack's story would conclude, it served as the perfect setup for Final Fantasy VII itself. Kitase was convinced, not least because any new fans may be inclined to then purchase Final Fantasy VII to find out more. But this decision meant Before Crisis Core was cancelled with immediate effect, and gamers outside of Japan never got to see any kind of official release for that game in any format. Sticking with the theme of cancelled properties in relation to Final Fantasy VII, we're next going to talk about a suite of planned mobile games that ended up kicking the bucket. As the 2010s loomed, Square Enix were paying more and more attention to the mobile space. They had made a few false moves in this area with games like Final Fantasy All the Bravest and Final Fantasy Tactics S. But having seen how well other publishers were doing, they persevered with the hopes that at least one of their properties may strike gold. As Final Fantasy VII was by far their biggest individual IP, and there was still a ton of hype around the possibility of a remake, they decided to try and take advantage by producing a suite of minigames associated with the original Final Fantasy VII. Many years prior, Square had actually tried this approach before, making a game for the snowboarding minigame. But this time, the G-Bike segment was chosen as the first game to be released, as it had a much closer connection with the prominent bike sequences from Advent Children. Ichiro Hozama was assigned to oversee production, and CyberConnect 2 were hired as third-party developers. Kitase and Nomura then provided general oversight. When the game launched, there was a high degree of praise for how good everything looked, but the negative side was that there was no longevity. And as interest died almost immediately after launch, with the game generating very little money as a result, service was terminated within 12 months. The remaining planned standalone games were then cancelled as a result, and CyberConnect 2 were moved over to working on the Final Fantasy VII Remake proper. At the same time as Square were attempting to build out the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, the same team were also trying to build towards creating the next mainline game in the franchise. After all, Kitase's team were the main Final Fantasy team, and they had just gone to market with the very profitable Final Fantasy X-2. Their initial aim was to build on what they had learned when creating Final Fantasy X and X-2 for the PlayStation 2 by developing a follow-up for the same system, and they estimated that it would take around 18 months. As they started work on the project at the beginning of 2004, this positioned Final Fantasy XIII as releasing towards the end of 2005 or start of 2006, just as the PlayStation 2 was starting to wind down. Plenty of initial planning was done, and the team had created prototype environments and were potentially experimenting with different graphical styles and a new dynamic combat system. However, while they toyed away, problems elsewhere within Square Enix ended up hindering their efforts. Final Fantasy XII had been announced at the start of 2001, and it was intended to launch in 2003. This then worked in with Sakaguchi's wider objective of having a major Final Fantasy game release every single year. 1999 had Final Fantasy VIII, 2000 had Final Fantasy IX, 2001 had Final Fantasy X, and 2002 had Final Fantasy XI. Final Fantasy XII was then meant to complete this puzzle, but Final Fantasy X-2 ended up having to take its slot alongside Crystal Chronicles. 2004 and 2005 then had no major Final Fantasy game released either, and this represented the first time in the history of the franchise that there had been 3 calendar years without a new numbered game. Final Fantasy XII ended up releasing in 2006, taking the last possible slot originally intended for Final Fantasy XIII. This then meant there was no point Final Fantasy XIII also releasing on the PlayStation 2, as the PlayStation 3 was releasing that same year. As a result, the PlayStation 2 version of the game was cancelled. But as the team had received such an incredible response in relation to the Final Fantasy VII Remake technical demo that had been shown off at E3 2005, they shifted their entire focus over to producing a new version of the game for the PlayStation 3. The mention of Final Fantasy XIII then makes for a nice transition, as at the same time the game was announced, Square Enix also announced 2 other games, Final Fantasy Versus 13 and Final Fantasy Agito 13. The plan was for these 3 games to have a shared mythology called Fabula Nova Crystallis, but outside of this, they were all to be independent and target completely different audiences. Final Fantasy XIII was there as the mainline entry, meant to appeal to existing fans of the franchise's mainline entries. Final Fantasy Versus 13 was then to serve as a juxtaposition, enabling Tetsuya Nomura to create an action RPG that made use of everything the team had learned from Kingdom Hearts, but through a much more mature lens. Final Fantasy Agito 13 was then designed to cater to casual fans, in the way that Before Crisis had already done so for the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. As such, it was designed as a mobile-exclusive episodic game. The only challenge was that when this grand plan was announced, almost nothing had been done behind the scenes on any of the games in the way of actual development. In the case of Agito 13, only the key art they showed off as part of the presentation had actually been made. Everything else was just theoretical plans. In an ideal world, Hajime Tabata, who was installed as the director of Agito 13, was to get straight to work, but other priorities kept cropping up. The aforementioned port of Before Crisis for the PSP, for example, ended up morphing into a full-scale project. But Tabata's team were also required to work on Kingdom Hearts Coded, another mobile game. By this point, members of the public started to ask questions about the status of Agito 13, as nothing had been heard about the game for around 2 years. To try and quell those voices, it was revealed that they were now planning to release Agito 13 for the PlayStation Portable, and that was the main reason for the hold-up. The reality was that there had just been no time to work on the game at all, and this was then further exacerbated when Tabata's team were required to work on another new game, this time in the Parasite Eve universe called The Third Birthday. The PR and marketing teams did put out some small beats throughout 2008, such as a screenshot from a closed mega theatre and a new trailer for the PSP version. But then there was near radio silence for almost another 3 years. When they spoke about the game again, it was announced that Agito 13 had been rebranded as Final Fantasy Type 0. This felt quite severe, but it was a necessary step for the development team. In 2009, there was a realization that not much had been done on the game, and that the original concept they theorized about some 3 to 4 years earlier no longer felt right. They therefore decided to go in a completely different direction when full development started, and felt it was better to simply cancel the original concept of Agito 13 and rebrand the game as something else. This meant that even though they retained the shared mythology of Fabula Nova Crystallis, the connection with Final Fantasy XIII was removed, and this then led to the Fabula Nova Crystallis logo being changed. When Final Fantasy Type 0 launched, it turned out to be a huge success. Famitsu scored it as a 39 out of 40, and it ended up as the 9th best-selling PSP game to ever launch in Japan. The success of Type 0 saw the team explore how they could build out the universe, but instead of coming up with something original, they decided to just revert back to the concept that was announced back in 2006. And to ensure the decision was quite clear, this meant they ended up producing a new episodic mobile game that they called Final Fantasy Agito. Agito then released in May of 2014, but even though there was a very high initial player base, it came with a number of issues that impacted player gameplay experience, such as long load times, imperfect controls, and other gameplay inconveniences. Still, countless episodes were released and enjoyed by players, and as Phase 1 of the story concluded, Square Enix announced that Final Fantasy Agito Plus, a more substantial version of the game being developed for the PlayStation Vita, was in the works. With Agito Plus designed to fix many of the grievances of the mobile game, the announcement was positively received. After all, problems related to performance as opposed to the actual content. But the project went through a troubled development cycle. In the end, the development team encountered an unprecedented amount of technical problems with the port, and it was announced in March of 2015 that they had encountered a bug that they just couldn't fix, and were hoping specialists at PlayStation could help them out. But as the game was then cancelled, around a year after it was announced, the assumption was that the bug was so drastic that there was no viable fix. But Agito Plus wasn't the only cancelled game relating to this specific subseries. There was, of course, the planned localized port of Type 0 for the PlayStation Portable that never saw the light of day, with numerous voiceover artists even talking about recording their lines back in 2012. Square Enix even announced that Final Fantasy Agito was to also be localized, only to then quietly pretend such an announcement never happened when the Japanese version of the game was shut down following the conclusion of its second phase. They also stated that Agito would be ported to Windows 10 devices, but that also never materialized. That's not all though, as a much bigger property relating to the Type franchise was teased and then never saw the light of day. Despite being part of the Fabula Nova Crystallis franchise, Type 0 was very much intended to be its own thing, and there was a long-term plan to create a much broader series as shown by Type 1, Type 2, and Type 3 all being trademarked. Hype for a follow-up to Type 0 began almost as soon as the game was released, but it wasn't until people saw the post-credits scene in Final Fantasy Type 0 HD that fans had something to latch onto. This was then further built upon when the team shared concept art for a future installment in the Type series at a PlayStation event in Hong Kong. Hajime Tabata, the director of Type 0, revealed that as the sub-franchise expanded, each entry was intended to focus on a different audience, with it being something of an antithesis to the wider franchise. This meant that the process of innovation was to be maintained with a new world and setting. But whereas mainline Final Fantasy games always created an original cast of characters unless they were direct sequels, Type 1 was to feature the exact same cast, just in an unconnected way. This harkened back to Sakaguchi's vision for Aki Ross from The Spirits Within, as she was meant to be treated like an actor as opposed to a character, able to play multiple roles irrespective of the medium or the genre. To that end, Class 0 was to star in Type 1, which was to be a very different type of game to Type 0, featuring a more adult and mature theme. If the project was successful, and the team continued to produce Type 2, then this was to be developed with a younger audience in mind. Similar to Type 1, which was cancelled early on in its concepting phase, Type 2 was cancelled before any meaningful work was done. And with Tabata leaving the company and Luminous Productions now dissolved, it feels like there's almost no chance for revival. That then brings us on to another project that has never seen the light of day for almost the exact same reason. Final Fantasy XV had one of the most infamous development cycles in video gaming history. After starting out as Versus 13, the project regularly changed hands, and even though it was eventually released in 2016, there was a sense it remained unfinished. Determined to right the wrongs, even though there were no initial plans, the development team turned Final Fantasy XV into a game as a service, providing regular patches and free content expansions to address issues such as completely reworking Chapter 13. And in general, they tried to make 15 a better experience overall. Alongside this, the team also developed standalone expansions called episodes. Each episode was devoted to a specific character, and they were intended to expand upon and paint a more complete picture for each character's story. The initial wave was Episode Gladiolus, Episode Prompto, and Episode Ignis, with Comrades releasing as a multiplayer expansion. With each release, the quality improved, and by the time Episode Ignis launched, there was enough positive sentiment for the development team to tease what was next. This meant, in a very unexpected move, they launched a huge survey asking fans what they wanted to see from Final Fantasy XV. And when the results were revealed, Tabata and Business Division 2 put their money where their mouth was by announcing a second season pass full of downloadable content that was planned to expand on the stories of Arden, Aranea, Lunafreya, and Noctis. However, of the planned second season pass, only episode Arden was ever released. Despite the full details of each episode not being known, each came with a specific title that hinted at what could have been. Episode Aranea was titled The Beginning of the End. Episode Lunafreya was titled The Choice of Freedom. And episode Noctis was titled The Final Strike. Unfortunately, the remaining 3 episodes were cancelled when Tabata, who was the project lead at the time, suddenly left Square Enix. To try and save face, the unreleased episodes were then reworked into a novel called The Dawn of the Future, which was penned by Emi Nagashima. Now, as mentioned, throughout its first 2 years, Final Fantasy XV received countless updates, but it also received plenty of other supporting properties too, such as a VR fishing game called Monster of the Deep. But there was also another VR experience announced that never ended up seeing the light of day. Originally, the Final Fantasy XV VR experience was supposed to be centered around Prompto, and it was announced at E3 2016 while also being playable on the show floor. But the immediate feedback was quite damning. The Verge described it as not very Final Fantasy, while Polygon described it as a mess, and Kotaku said it was flat out terrible. The premise of the demo was that the player took control of Prompto, first person, in the fight against Deadeye from Episode to Sky. You had to shoot Deadeye while your compatriots went in with melee attacks, and if he charged you, you had to move out of the way. In summary, it was a pretty simple game, akin to many light gun games of the past. The initial plan was for the VR experience to release later that year, with VG247 even stating that it was due to release on the 30th of September. However, due to feedback, the team decided to not move forward with this concept. They felt that fixing the game to make it more compelling would have taken too much time and effort, and they also ended up drawing the same conclusion after briefly entertaining the idea of making another VR game centered around other party members and their core mechanics. It was for this reason that the team ultimately went with producing something much more manageable, a fishing game. As part of Final Fantasy XV's original launch, the development team planned out quite a few initiatives to keep players engaged while away from the game. And there was a solid theory behind this. Sony and Sega even explored this concept via the Pocket Station and the VMU, with the Dreamcast even integrating it into their actual system design. What they planned with Final Fantasy XV wasn't quite as integrated, but it did still attempt to provide immersion. The plan was to produce 2 mobile games that had in-universe applications. The first was a reboot of King's Knight, Sakaguchi's first game for the Famicom, with Noctis and his bros even playing it while camping alongside, apparently, a lot of other people in the world. The second was then a more detailed version of Justice Monsters, a pinball game that could be found in many of the Crow's Nest diners scattered throughout EOS. Both of these games did end up launching, but they also had a torrid time in development. King's Knight ended up suffering from severe delays because the feedback they got from beta testing was just so bad, and Justice Monsters 5 ended up struggling to make much money because the gameplay loop wasn't strong enough. It was announced at the Final Fantasy XV Uncovered event that Justice Monsters 5 was being created for iOS, Android, and Windows 10 devices. But after the game suffered from numerous delays and then failed to perform, the Windows 10 version of the game never ended up materializing and was quietly cancelled. Justice Monsters 5 and the King's Knight reboot were not the only properties planned for creation in relation to the Final Fantasy XV universe. As the game got closer to launch, countless other properties were either released or announced, and this trend only continued after the game shipped. Platinum Demo, for example, was more akin to a prologue, as gamers got to play as a young Noctis, exploring his dreams and forming a bond with Carbuncle. A King's Tale was an old-school 16-bit style beat-em-up where gamers got to play as a young Regis and his friends Wescom, Claris and Cid. This was made available as a pre-order bonus in North America, becoming free for players all around the world around 4 months after launch. Final Fantasy XV: A New Empire was released around 6 months after the launch of the main game as a predatory and often derided mobile game that still ended up generating over $500 million. Then there was the VR fishing game called Monster of the Deep, which, as we mentioned, rose from the ashes of another cancelled VR game. Final Fantasy XV was even relaunched as Final Fantasy XV Pocket Edition, a streamlined version of the game that released with an episodic structure. But few remember that a Final Fantasy XV MMO was also announced that was tentatively called Final Fantasy XV Mobile, and it was to be focused on the Chinese market. The concept was first announced back in 2017, with Tabata and Yosuke Matsuda appearing on stage to reveal that the game was planned to release in 2019. Not much else was known about the project at this time, however. 2019 then came and went, and still nothing was known about the project. Then, in 2020, almost 2 years after Tabata had left Square Enix, a Korean publication called Invent posted a full report on the upcoming game. It stated that a Korean developer called JSC Games were collaborating with 2 Chinese companies called the Shanghai Oriental Pearl Media Company and Gaia, a global interactive entertainment company. Their aim was to create a large-scale multiplayer game in Unreal Engine 4 based on the Final Fantasy XV universe. This intrigued players, and they were further intrigued when it was revealed that the game was actually set in a parallel universe and also in a different timeline. The story, however, was to begin right after Noctis embarked on his journey from the capital city, with him also going on an adventure to save the world. But EOS would now feature new towers and dungeons, and even floating continents. New characters had also been created, and members of the Kingsglaive were to be given larger roles. A trailer was promised for the first half of 2020, but the game was never heard from again. And although it was never officially cancelled, JSC Games filed for bankruptcy at the end of 2023, so it's safe to assume this game is dead. As video game development entered into the high-definition era, Square Enix sent numerous delegates of developers to Western studios so they could learn how they were adapting to the change. On one such trip, a Square Enix delegation visited a Scandinavian developer called Grin, and having been impressed, they were invited to come over to Japan to pitch their vision for how they would create a new game in the rather obscure Lord of Vermilion franchise. After arriving, Grin found out the goalposts had moved. Instead of Lord of Vermilion, Square Enix were wanting to understand how a Western studio would handle creating a AAA game based in the world of Ivalice, something that led to the birth of a project called Fortress. Having been fans of Ivalice themselves, many of the people at Grin wanted to create a true successor to Final Fantasy XII, with Bosch planned to serve as the main protagonist in their vision. And the narrative was to then be based around his quest to defeat Lomond, the Sea King, an entity that rose every 10,000 years to seek revenge against Ash's ancestors. Extensive planning was undertaken, and tons of concept art and assets were produced, but even though such extensive planning was undertaken, the game, unfortunately, never came to fruition. According to one of Grin's founders, Ulf Andersson, he was aware that Square Enix were testing the waters, and one of the main complications was around disagreements over the game's art style. Even though they had asked Grin to propose their vision, Square Enix were unhappy with how much it deviated from what they themselves would have produced if they were making the game. The Japanese arm felt that Grin had taken things too far by focusing on a Nordic aesthetic. This feedback led to Grin scrapping numerous concepts and going back, essentially, to the drawing board, something that led to some serious crunch as Square Enix decided to not extend agreed upon deadlines. The situation then became more difficult following the acquisition of Eidos Interactive. Prior to the purchase, Grin were liaising with Square Enix Japan directly, but after, all communications had to be filtered through Square Enix's new UK office, which was made up of Eidos Interactive employees. But the only challenge was that those employees also had their own opinions. This led to more delays due to nothing more than miscommunication, and with the project not progressing as intended, Square Enix ultimately pulled funding, and Fortress never saw the light of day. Another Ivalice property, Final Fantasy Tactics, is a game beloved by fans for providing players with in-depth tactical role-playing gameplay coupled with a brutal and compelling story. Due to the project's success, Sakaguchi then sought to further broaden the horizons of Ivalice, and this was to be provided in the form of a sequel that was tentatively dubbed Final Fantasy Tactics II. According to revealed design documents, Tactics II was planned to do away with the original isometric gameplay system, instead focusing on a 2D hexagonal grid system. Jobs would have continued to be an important aspect of the game, but some of the screenshots and bits of information surrounding the title suggested that showdowns between individual characters would have been given greater focus amongst the grander scheme of events within the game. Even though the project was ambitious, it was unfortunately unable to pan out. From its inception, the game's development was plagued with difficulties. At the time, there was a push for game sequels to release closer together to ride the momentum of the first game's popularity and success. But the key staff responsible for the success of the original game, such as Matsuno and Ito and their respective development teams, were too busy with other projects like Vagrant Story and Final Fantasy IX. Square had considered waiting for Matsuno to finish Vagrant Story so that he could lead Tactics II, but instead opted to outsource development so they didn't lose time. Although much is not publicly known about the full reason for the project being cancelled, there was apparently a large number of challenges that resulted in the project's completion becoming unfeasible, and part of this was likely because of Sakaguchi's then increased involvement in Final Fantasy IX and The Spirits Within. Later on, Matsuno did attempt to take charge of Tactics II at Sakaguchi's request, but balancing this hefty task alongside development of Vagrant Story proved to be too difficult. This, along with a multitude of other behind-the-scenes issues, essentially impeded any further progress on the game's development, and as a result, the project met an early and unfortunate demise. After this, the Tactics series did see further installments though, via Tactics Advance and Tactics A2, but fans have often called for a more direct sequel to the original Tactics game. That then brings us onto a statement from Naoki Yoshida, who said he believed that it was about time for a new entry in the Tactics franchise, which has revived hope amongst some fans for some kind of Tactics revival. But although Yoshida's statement means there is a chance for Square Enix to refresh interest in the Tactics series, the company hasn't always had the best track record with rebooting interest in older games, such as their failed attempt to relaunch Final Fantasy XI. To commemorate Final Fantasy XI's long run and loyal player base, Square Enix decided to go big on what at the time was supposed to be the game's last scenario expansion, Rhapsodies of Vana'diel. This gave rise to the Vana'diel project. But as the decision had been taken to sunset the PlayStation 2 and Xbox 360 versions of the game, Square Enix decided it would be smart to focus on the ever-growing mobile gaming scene. Thus, alongside the new chapter, they announced the Final Fantasy XI mobile project. The mobile project consisted of 2 titles. One of these was called Grandmasters, an exclusive role-playing game for phones, but it was perhaps the other game that garnered more interest and attention, as it was an adapted version of Final Fantasy XI itself. This ambitious project, which was revealed under the provisional title of Final Fantasy XI-R, short for Final Fantasy XI Reboot, was interestingly dubbed an MMMRPG, which stood for Massively Multiplayer Mobile Role-Playing Game. To execute their plans, Square Enix partnered with a Korean gaming company called Nexon, with whom they already had a working relationship, thanks to the Korean server of Final Fantasy XIV. And as the name and project suggested, this was an effort to effectively deliver the complete Final Fantasy XI experience on mobile devices. To achieve this, gameplay had to be adapted considerably. This included the incorporation of a touch-based interface as well as a faster-paced battle system to complement the medium's convenience factor. The development team also sought to seamlessly implement the MMO's original story, as well as create a graphically enhanced version via Unreal Engine 4. They also wanted to make solo gameplay more viable while still retaining the community-centric feel of the original game. The initial plan was for the game to launch in 2016. However, things didn't go to that plan. During the Nexon Developer Conference in April 2016, some screenshots of a redesigned Windurst and Saruta Baruta were revealed to the public, but nothing else was shared. We then had the opportunity to speak to Yoshida at the end of 2017 to ask what was happening behind the scenes. He insisted that the game was still in development, something that was verified by Nexon continuing to hire staff for the project. In 2018, it was then revealed that production was being handled by Nexon 1 Studio, but instead of being a complete replica of the original game, just on mobile, it had been transformed into an RPG trading card game that was renamed as Final Fantasy XI Mobile. More silence then followed until screenshots leaked in early 2020, but later in the year, Nexon revealed that the game had been cancelled, with a difference of opinion between Square Enix and Nexon over the game's vision and direction cited as the main reason. If we stick with the theme of MMOs, we would be remiss not to mention Final Fantasy XIV. The original version, which launched in 2010, went through a torrid time. But we aren't going to talk about the eventual cancellation of that, as even though some still believe what launched was akin to a beta product, the game did actually release. What we're going to focus on instead is a version of Final Fantasy XIV that was promised, but never delivered. Final Fantasy XIV was announced during E3 2009 at the PlayStation press conference. It caught many by surprise, as Final Fantasy XIII wasn't even out yet. But there was also a sense that the company was reverting back to how they were at the turn of the millennium. At one point, Square even revealed to investors that they had 23 games in the pipeline, a far cry from the current situation we find ourselves in today. As Final Fantasy XIV was revealed at the PlayStation press conference, this meant a PlayStation 3 version was in the works alongside a PC version. But the game only launched on PC. The initial plan was to launch both versions simultaneously, but with development being less than smooth, the decision was taken to do a staggered launch. Hiromichi Tanaka later explained to the now defunct publication Now Gamer that problems arose when attempting to optimize assets. They knew from the outset that the PlayStation 3 had a lower memory capacity, but this process ended up being a lot more complicated than they had first anticipated. They therefore adjusted the plan to first shipping the PC version, then turning their attention to creating the PlayStation 3 port. Square Enix were very confident in this new plan, and even packaged bonuses into Final Fantasy XIII that could be redeemed in the PlayStation 3 version of Final Fantasy XIV. With the PC launch going so badly, resources were not able to be allocated to the PlayStation 3 port. This led to a new provisional release date being set as March 2011. However, 2 months after the launch of the PC version, Yuichi Wada, the then president and CEO of Square Enix, issued a lengthy statement. Alongside addressing fundamental leadership changes that were planned to take place, Wada also said that the PlayStation 3 version of Final Fantasy XIV was being pushed back. The reason being that they didn't just simply want to port the PC version, and instead wanted to create a new version that included all of the improvements they had planned. 8 months later, Naoki Yoshida, who had taken over the project, said that the PlayStation 3 version would come out at all costs. However, what people didn't realize at the time was that Yoshida was not talking about the PlayStation 3 version of the current iteration of the game. Instead, the PlayStation 3 version of Final Fantasy 1.0 was quietly cancelled. This became very clear on the 27th of August 2013, the launch date of Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn. On this day, a remade version of Final Fantasy XIV did launch on PC and PS3, but players never got to play the original version of 14 on their home consoles. That then brings us on to the most well-known cancelled game associated with Final Fantasy, Versus 13. As mentioned earlier, Versus 13 was meant to be part of the Fabula Nova Crystallis sub-franchise, and as such, it was very much intended to be a spin-off game that leveraged the same mythology as Final Fantasy XIII and Agito 13. Each game was to be overseen by a different director, with Motomo Toriyama overseeing the main project, having done a successful job with Final Fantasy X-2, and Hajime Tabata looking after Agito 13, having turned Before Crisis into a cash cow. Versus 13 was then to be directed by Tetsuya Nomura, with the Kingdom Hearts team overseeing development. The team's trademark dramatic flair was evident in the game's first trailer, which premiered at E3 2006. It showcased a world that was stylistically very different from Final Fantasy XIII, with the juxtaposition between light and dark clear as day, and the whole aesthetic and premise resonated with expectant audiences. This led to a ton of interest around the game, and that interest continued to be sustained despite the road to release being plagued with a myriad of issues. By 2011, 5 years after its announcement, the general public was still none the wiser about what was happening. And this was further emphasised when I actually asked Katase about it point blank when I had the chance to speak to him at Gamescom. Out of nothing more than hope, I asked whether Versus 13 was planned to release in 2011. And in reply, Katase said, "We have no release date information to update. Unfortunately, we can't say anything about that. We can't commit ourselves to 2011 either." Interestingly though, was that even back then, there were theories that due to its slow progress, it may end up becoming Final Fantasy XV. In the comments of my news story back in 2010, Destructo888 predicted this by saying, "I'm betting the next Versus trailer we'll see will end with the title Final Fantasy XV. Either that, or it won't even have the Final Fantasy name." Fast forward 3 years, and that's exactly what happened, as a new Versus 13 trailer was shown, only for the logo to update to Final Fantasy XV. However, this change had been coming for a long time. Under Nomura, Versus 13 had made slow but consistent progress. Due to his skill set, Nomura was tasked with aiding on numerous projects at the same time, and the same was asked of the Kingdom Hearts development team too. As Final Fantasy XIII encountered problems, resources were reallocated, and other projects just became more important, such as the creation of Kingdom Hearts spin-offs and Final Fantasy VII spin-offs. There started to become an appreciation that things couldn't continue in this manner, and it led to some harsh decisions being made as senior figures decided whether Versus 13 should just be cancelled, especially as an entirely new console generation had now entered into the equation. After nearly 6 years of constant delays and obstacles, in 2012 the project switched to development for the next generation of consoles, and this resulted in its biggest change, as Versus 13 was internally rebranded to Final Fantasy XV. After its rebranding, the game experienced quite the overhaul, and much of this was overseen by Hajime Tabata, who after completing Type 0 was assigned as co-director, with much of his team joining the development staff. Tabata then ended up replacing Nomura as the main director, and he was given the interesting task of not just delivering the game to market within 3 years, but getting gamers excited about a project that was now over 6 years old and was going to be morphed into something that was similar, but also very different from the proposed vision. This saw characters like Stella Nox Fleury completely cut, and the wider scenario was adapted to suit this new vision. Large parts were also removed from the game, transitioned into supporting content such as Kingsglaive or DLC episodes, so that they could manufacture more development time for themselves. It's unclear how much truth there is, but numerous rumours ended up being posted that suggested Versus 13 was planned to be an epic trilogy of games, with characters such as Glauca, Clarus, Ravus and Idolus given much more time to develop. Given how surgical the story changes were, this does make a degree of sense, as by condensing 3 games into one, there are bound to be some challenges. What's interesting, however, is that Versus 13 may be gone, but it hasn't been forgotten, with Nomura constantly teasing numerous concepts relating to Versus 13 within Kingdom Hearts 3. And in the most obvious of these, a curious storyline has been embedded within the game via VIII Rex. The main character of VIII Rex, Yozora, bears an eerie resemblance to Noctis. And what's more, there's a scene of Yozora waking up inside a moving car, which is nearly identical to the iconic scene of Noctis waking up in his car in the 2011 Versus 13 trailer. That, though, concludes our extra long journey. Thank you so much everyone for watching. My name is Daryl, and this has been every known cancelled Final Fantasy game that we've been able to find out about over the years. If you enjoyed learning about these games, please consider showing us how much you appreciate the effort we've gone to by giving the video a like. Any interactions you make really do help the channel out. Interactions come in all forms though, and we are incredibly grateful to receive the support of Benjamin Snow, Chris M. Walker, Christopher Gardner, Christopher Milstead, Clever Chavez, Cody Keith, the YouTube channel EXP Required, Gregory, Nate Hancock, Stephen and Sukun TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters. Without them, and the names you're now seeing on screen, running the channel would be very difficult in its current form. You can help fund the channel for as little as $3 per month, and this gets you access to videos early, free from advertising, an exclusive podcast where I give my thoughts about Final Fantasy, audio-only versions of super long-form content like this, and voting rights to help us determine our next major project. You can find a link in the description below. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.